Sincere Kirabo is the American Humanist Association's social justice coordinator. He writes about atheism, culture, humanism, and social issues from an intersectional approach. He contributes to various online media, including The Humanist, Everyday Feminism, and his blogs, Notes from an Apostate on Patheos, and his new one, Missives from the Ether, on The Orbit, which is a new blog network dedicated to atheism and social justice. Please help me welcome Sincere Kirabo.
So, a couple things before I start. As Jason mentioned, I'm a writer. So I'm a writer first before I'm a speaker. So I always have notes with me. I've done speaking engagements before, of course, and it usually revolves around these same issues that I'm going to be talking about today as far as the intersection of humanism and social justice. The second thing I wanted to mention was that I'm someone who is philosophical. I'm someone who greatly enjoys and appreciates philosophy. I've studied it for years, not just strictly Western philosophy or the names that we're used to like Nietzsche or Bertrand Russell, but some more modern philosophers. And I've interviewed philosophers before, like John Searle. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him. So philosophy, I think, really helps us challenge our thoughts and our worldviews. And I think that's important. And so going straight into this discussion, I'm actually going to be quoting a philosopher, Socrates. He said, allegedly, at his trial, he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Now, a brief context for that. Socrates was someone whose life exemplified a life based upon questioning and answer seeking. He was referred to as a gadfly. He was pesky in that he was always questioning the status quo. I don't know how many are familiar with the term Socratic method. It's got on people's nerves. So basically, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth. But really what it came down to was him constantly questioning the status quo. And it was also allegedly said that he didn't properly give reverence to the gods of their day. So he chose execution over being exiled. He could have continued on living in exile or be executed. And to him, because he firmly believed that life was about questioning ourselves and others, that it is about scrutinizing what we think and why we think it, that if he wasn't able to do that, then there was no point in living. So he literally embodied life without, the unexamined life is not worth living. So what does that phrase have to do with the discussion today? In order for us to be better allies and to be better appreciative and understand one another, there has to be that curiosity there. We have to examine the way we think and why we think things that we do. This coincides with metacognition, which is thinking about our thinking. So to a certain extent, you could rephrase Socrates' quote as, "The unexamined thought is not worth thinking." But not in a literal sense, because that would be absurd. I mean, you can't, that's not possible. But what it means is that to exercise metacognition, to utilize that curiosity to really examine what we think, how to acquire knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, what we acquire, and ruminate about our thoughts, about our perceptions. So another quote I want to use is Bertrand Russell. I love him. I love his work. He was a logician. He was a philosopher. He was an academic. He said, "In all affairs, is a healthy thing now and again to hang a question mark on things we have long taken for granted." This coincides with everything I mentioned regarding the Socratic quote and then also metacognition. It's about wanting to know. Wanting to understand is the key to the desire of that curiosity, to understand and better identify with others. So within the context of the discussion today, Socratic thinking and metacognition, and again, the Russell quote I just mentioned, is going to help us confront our biases and the various forms of privilege that color our views, whether it be about ourselves, whether it be about other individuals or groups, and how we see the world in general. So the circle discussion to allyship. For those who want to be allies or to otherwise support those who are of other groups, marginalized groups, the key to that is caring. Obviously, you wouldn't put yourself in a situation where you're going to empathize with someone else or to show support or to actively promote their viewpoints and their lived experiences unless you care. The Anti-Oppression Network defines allyship as the following: an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person of privilege seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group of people. The motivation to being an ally is compassion. So, without answering or saying anything out loud, I want you to think within yourselves what you think compassion is, what it means. How do you conceptualize it? How do you practice it in your own lives? Again, don't say anything aloud. I just want you to think about that for a minute. Recently, I attended an event in D.C. with Rabbi Daniel Hartman. He is the author of Putting God Second. He has a semi-humanist philosophy that he has. I say semi because he still staunchly firmly believes in God. I attended the event thinking that was going to be more what I thought to be more humanist-minded. And it was to a certain extent, but he's still adamant about the God part. But anyway, there's a certain part, a fulcrum to his belief system was a story that he kept on reiterating throughout the entire discussion, and that involved the Babylonian Jewish leader Hillel. Maybe some have heard of him. So the story goes that a Gentile went to Hillel saying that he wanted to convert to Judaism. He says, okay, I want you to teach me the Torah while I stand on one foot. And so he does this, and of course, we know that the Torah has 613 commandments, and he expected Hillel, like it was a test. He expected Hillel to teach him everything about the Torah while he stood on one foot. And Hillel just simply looked at him while he's standing on one foot, and he says, what you consider hateful, don't do unto others. This is the Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. That's what he said. And so Hartman used this to emphasize his point that he was trying to bring about his philosophy, which was that from this story, he took it to mean that the reason why he did this is because Hillel could have just as easily quoted scripture, Leviticus 17:18, I believe. He could have easily quoted scripture, but instead he chose to paraphrase scripture to make his point. And so from that, Hartman used that to say, well, it's about using scripture as a guidance tool rather than a strict prescription. So he used this to justify his philosophy that we should be more concerned with others and how we treat others, and use religious text as a guidance, but not as a strict prescription. So he condemned, there's a lot of things that he said about religious beliefs in general, not just Judaism. He considers religious belief to suffer from an autoimmune disease, and that it's evident in the fact that religious people tend to not act any better than non-religious people. So that was the fulcrum of his argument. But anyway, the reason why I bring that up is from that quote from Hillel, what that comes back to is the golden rule, or the ethic of reciprocity that we're all familiar with. The ethic of reciprocity is a life philosophy that centers on compassion. But despite what some may say and despite what Hartman believed, it far precedes biblical tradition. So compassion is central to all major world faiths. Each one has evolved their own form of the golden rule, actually. And the goal of this praxis of compassion is to discover what gives you mental or emotional or physical pain, and then refuse under any circumstances to inflict that evil upon someone else. So this principle existed in Egyptian antiquity and also in the Confucian philosophy as well. So it wasn't something that just magically appeared in biblical texts. And actually, what more than likely happened, what we see in the New Testament that people commonly refer to as the Golden Rule was likely influenced by Hillel because he was a well-known religious leader in that time. The conscious decision to allow compassion to reign allows you to dethrone yourself from the center of your world and place someone else there. And in that act, we transcend ourselves. When we act with compassion, it should be modeled after what the Chinese philosopher Mozi, his injunction of John I, which means impartial concern. And this compassion, this form of compassion, is unlimited, unconditional concern for others that makes no distinction from self or other or friend or stranger. It's also referred to as universal love. So when we think of compassion, this is what it should mean, and this is how it ought to be used when we're talking about concern for others. The problem, of course, is that this isn't usually what we see when we're talking about compassion. Our cultural imagination is hollow when it comes to compassion. It's often one-dimensional or exclusionary. The social canon of compassion within our culture tends to be hampered by discrimination or various forms of privilege. And due to certain forms of privilege, that produces a certain level of detachment from issues that don't directly impact our lives. That's what happens. So we suffer from a disconnect from marginalized groups. The humanist philosophy, at the core of the humanist philosophy, is the belief that all life has equal significance. And without that Socratic curiosity, and without the desire to better understand others, compassion is incomplete. Philosopher Baruch Spinoza said something I think really drives this point home. He said, "I have labored carefully, not to mock, not to lament, not to condemn human actions, but to understand them." This is important because what Spinoza is talking about is a form of compassion that helps us to be more contemplative and to be more reserved and think more. This goes, of course, back to what I mentioned in the beginning when it comes to metacognition, to think more about our place in the world and where others are and where they're coming from. So we could use that as an example of when we're talking about, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, when they intervene in political issues across the nation, or when there was the incident in Baltimore with the murder of Freddie Gray and the uprising that we saw there. What I saw was, and I wrote about this on my blog on Patheos, what I saw was the diverging views and attitudes between blacks and whites about what was taking place and why it was taking place. And some people tend to be, because they're on the outside looking in, they have a lower appreciation or no appreciation whatsoever for the social context of where these people are coming from as far as the issues that happened in Baltimore and Black Lives Matter movement. But the thing we have to remember is compassion isn't about agreeing with someone. It's not even about liking them, to be honest. Compassion is about making a choice to honor someone else's humanity. And again, when it comes to the humanist philosophy, what we're talking about is what humanists believe is in the equal significance of all human life. Compassion is instinctive, but it has to be harnessed and practiced. If not, what we get are debilitated forms of compassion, like the tendency for us to stick to our own tribes or people who look or act or think like us. This brings to mind something that I did last year. I wrote an article. Before I wrote the article, I did some research. How many here are familiar with Stormfront? Anybody know it? Yeah. So I saw something that someone said on social media. I'll explain what it is in a minute. I saw something someone said on social media, and I was like, when I'm talking about compassion and trying to understand others, and what I saw was stark disparity in the way certain people who proclaim to be, whether they were humanists or atheists or from both camps, in how they treated others. And so someone had told me about Stormfront, because I didn't know what it was, but it's a white nationalist website. And so I go in there because someone told me that, oh, well, you know that they have a subthread there where atheists convene. I was like, no, they don't. So I went in there. I had to create my own little profile, so I did that. Yes, I impersonated a white guy. And I go in there, and I was very surprised. I shouldn't say I was surprised. I was disappointed in what I saw. They do have subthreads. There's more than one, actually, for atheists and whatnot. And somehow they were able to reconcile some very hateful and mean-spirited things and beliefs that they had for marginalized groups. And from their point of view, they're on the side of good. And so I wrote about this. I wrote about that specifically, but also about other issues that I saw within the secular community. But what that reminds me of is the need for compassion and the curiosity to want to know more about others rather than sticking to your own. And this is where intersectionality comes in. I'm sure some have heard the term before. Intersectionality is a concept first coined, is a legal concept first coined by legal scholar and academic Kimberly Crenshaw as a way to describe multiple forms of oppression that people experience. She used it as a way to exhibit how Black women experience a unique discrimination that intersects with sexism and racism, and that it cannot be categorized solely as racist or solely as sexist, but you had to consider them both simultaneously. And she said, regarding this, she said, the intersectionality experience within Black women is more powerful than the sum of their race and sex, and that any observations that do not take intersectionality into consideration cannot accurately address the manner in which Black women are subordinated. She further observed the way Black women are frequently absent from the analysis of gender oppression and racism, because the former tends to be centered on white women and the latter tends to be centered on Black men. That's why it tends to be the case whenever you see issues related, and this is something that you see in the media, obviously, when you see issues related to racial injustice on TV and the media, you tend to see is them talking about Tamir Rice or Michael Brown, Freddie Gray. What they tend to not do is talk about women. They don't talk about the Rakia boys and so on and so forth. This is a bias that we have. And more broadly, the intersectional approach is necessary to be contemplative and appreciate the way we are all made up of multiple identities, and that each identity is accorded a certain level of value or lack thereof. Now, me personally, I'm a cisgendered, straight, able-bodied man. And because of that, I have certain privileges, and I don't experience certain forms of bigotry and oppression that others would, insofar as it relates to gender identity, sexual orientation. However, at the same time, I am Black, and I am subject to other specific injustices or discriminations due to our culture, our anti-Black culture. Something that I think sums that part up is the fact that something Audre Lorde said. She says that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. This is why it's imperative that we adopt the principles of intersectionality to upgrade our perspective and enhance our compassion towards others and our capacity for understanding where they're coming from, and that the world is made up of far more than just our insular experiences. A few years later, after Kimberly Crenshaw wrote that paper, this is back in the 80s, sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, she began using the term in her work. And she said, cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated, but are bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society, such as race, gender, class, and ethnicity. Me being a black humanist atheist, and being aware of the way privilege works and detaches privileged people within the secular movement. It's been an interesting experience, not just within the secular community, but in general. But right now I'm talking about the secular community. I've seen racist atheists, I've seen misogynist atheists who decried feminism. I've seen atheists who spout anti-Muslim bigotry. I've seen trans-antagonistic feminist atheists. I've seen a lot of this going on. And all these people still see themselves as a force for good as they fight for their tribe. Those are their ilk. There's, I'm going to quote here, that just screams a total ignorance of intersectionality, among other things. This person said, "I am an atheist, which makes me a member of the most hated and despised minority in the USA. We are hated much more than homosexuals, Muslims, recent immigrants, or any racial, ethnic, or religious minority in this country." When I saw that, I critiqued it severely, both on his status and then when I made my own and I talked about that. These kind of comments tend to be belched from an insular perspective. And it's true that atheists are discriminated against. I mean, I think we know that. But seeing as how this particular person was a well-educated, white, straight, cisgendered, and able-bodied man, he is exempted and thus insulated and disconnected from a gargantuan amount of social, economic, and political deprivations. This is precisely the type of parochial mindset that we must transcend if we are to be advocates for substantive, inclusionary social change. As Bell Hooks aptly stated, to build community requires vigilant awareness of the work we must continually do to undermine all the socialization that leads us to behave in ways that perpetuate domination. In order for us to achieve progress, we must embrace intersectionality, because the intersection of privileges and discriminations demands a destabilization of various streams of inequality for a fight against inequality to truly be broadly effective. So something I wrote about a while ago and I've spoken about several times are what I think are 3 keys to helping us better attend to these issues. And the first one is observing constancy. In order for us to better comprehend the faults in present day, not just race relations, but in all discussions when we're talking about misrepresented or marginalized groups, is to actively and continually discuss these issues. Think of issues that you talk about on a daily basis, what you consider your pet issues, what you commonly talk about on social media or when you're talking amongst your friends or associates at work or whatever. Think about those type of issues that you're commonly talking about. Observing constancy means that you go beyond just, for example, if a tragedy happens in the news and you talk about that and you give your own 2 cents on that for that brief moment in time, and then you move on, you talk about something else, and you don't give it a second thought. Observing constancy is the act of actively participating in these discussions, whether it be related to gender inequality or racial inequality or heteronormativity, so on and so forth. Something that I think is important is, when it comes to observing constancy, is you have to want, and it goes back to curiosity, so you have to want to reach out and learn more than what you know right now in this place where you're at in your life. So observing constancy looks like something that Jason mentioned. He doesn't allow himself to be insulated within an echo chamber, so he reaches out for people who make him uncomfortable. I do the same thing. For example, when it comes to issues related to the way women are denigrated or treated as opposed to men, I put myself, for example, I'll put myself in social media groups. I won't say anything. I'll go into these groups where I'll just sit back and I'll observe the experiences that women relay that they go through on an everyday basis. And it helped me, it greatly informed my view when it comes to gender issues. Or on top of that, I'll read articles specifically by women so I can get a better idea of where they're coming from and what they've gone through. This, again, helps me better inform my way of thinking. I also read feminist theory put out specifically by women philosophers. There's one piece called Critical Thinking in Feminism. I love critical thinking. Okay, cool. It's a good piece. You can find that online. All this stuff is online. All this stuff is easily accessible if we're curious enough to go out and search for it. And I have friends, so I have people that I continually talk to about those issues. This is what observing constancy looks like. If we seek to be allies, hold on, I'm got ahead of myself here. Oh no, I'm right. Okay. If we seek to be allies, to be advocates for change and social parity, we must immerse ourselves in the struggle to endeavor to better comprehend the pain and injustice that we don't directly experience. There is no better way to do that than by speaking directly with those who endure that disparity. So, habitually engaging in these kinds of conversations and that type of information builds awareness, just like I was referencing before when it came to women. And it works to destabilize misconceptions and better facilitates progress. Interrelated with observing constancy is granting a platform. This is something that some people don't like to hear. I interviewed, oh my gosh, what's his name? I'll think about it later. Arno Michaelis. He is a former leader in a white supremacy group. He also was a head singer, the lead singer for a white supremacy hardcore band. I can't remember their name. Anyway, long story short, he turned his life around after he had a kid that really put things into perspective for him as far as all the violence that he was involved with in that ideology that he had. Turned his life around. He's a humanist, and he does anti-racism work. And I interviewed him, and everything, hearing his story is inspiring, it's interesting, but when it came to talking about granting platforms, there was a little bit of pushback there on his part. And I tried to explain where I was coming from so he could get a better idea of what I was talking about. Because he does observe constancy, but he had a little trouble with granting a platform. Now, granting the platform goes hand in hand with observing constancy. You must have both. If you are not part of an outgroup, it is preferable to grant a platform to those who are subject to the ostracism and stigmatization. Outgroups are those who tend to be othered as not one of us. So allowing individuals from outgroups a platform to share their perspectives regarding discrimination may deepen your level of empathy and perspective. Like today, what we're doing right now, for example. Now, I spoke about compassion, but part and parcel to compassion is empathy. Now, there is a cognitive science breakdown of what empathy is and exists within 4 criteria when these 4 criteria are met. 1, an individual is experiencing an emotional response. 2, the emotional response corresponds to the emotional state of another. 3, the emotional response is achieved by imagining or observing the emotional state of the other person. And 4, the individual attributes the source of their own emotional response to the other person. This is the cognitive science breakdown of what empathy entails. So when we fail to place ourselves in the shoes of others, we fail to properly respond to whatever situation or issue they're dealing with. This is why empathy is important. And this is why privilege is so insidious. A breakdown, I'm going to give a brief definition of what privilege is a myriad of social advantages associated with being part of a particular group. It creates a rift between human experiences based upon intersectional identities. Privilege exempts an individual from encountering certain realities outgroup members are routinely subjected to. It biases judgment, and it inhibits one's ability to identify with the real lived context of marginalized groups. In short, it inhibits our ability to relate, and thus empathize with the similar identities from our own. This is the problem with those who lack an intersectional approach to reality. When you come from a place of a privileged social position, when you begin to lose ground of that privilege that you're so used to, that state of where you're used to having certain things done in a certain way, that feels like oppression. And we see this with, for example, Christians who sincerely believe that they're being persecuted when certain laws get changed or certain laws get struck down that they are used to going in their favor. They seriously believe that they're being persecuted. Now, those who aren't Christian and those who don't observe and aren't a part of the Christian hegemony, we're on the outside looking in and we can see how absurd that is. But that is what we're talking about here. It's hard to see those claims as anything other than laughable. Likewise, when we see certain white people who truly believe reverse racism is an actual thing, and that they are discriminated against more than minorities, like certain polls that have been taken recently shows. Again, in relation to minorities, people who are of minority groups, they feel that they're discriminated against more than those people. It's hard to not view this disgruntlement as anything more than thoughtless and sincerely uninformed, given the way attitudes informed by racial stratification places whiteness at its pinnacle and have been baked into the social DNA of this culture. This is why granting platforms are important, though. When we fail to seek enlightenment from the outgroups, we're inclined to possess uninformed or patronizing views about matters we're only tenuously familiar with, by virtue of hearsay, anecdote, or what we're used to hearing from certain forms of media or any type of information we're used to receiving that confirms our biases. Now, granting a platform to those who are experiencing certain types of discrimination and so on and so forth. This helps reduce such ridiculousness and allows our preformed beliefs to be upgraded through the eyes of those experiencing the hurt, the frustration, the anxiety. The last key, on top of observing constancy, granting platform, is perspective taking. And this also is interrelated to granting a platform. Perspective taking is rooted in the cognitive skill known as theory of mind. Theory of mind, and thus perspective taking, seeks to understand the mental states of others, and that includes their thoughts, their feelings, their desires, motivations, and intentions. Research by neuroscientists suggests perspective taking increases one's willingness to engage with negatively stereotyped outgroup members. This is achieved mainly by creating social bonds, increased contact with stereotyped people. When we attain heightened awareness, in order to obtain heightened awareness about these type of issues, I suggest removing ourselves from our comfort zones. Again, like it was mentioned before I even came on, removing ourselves from situations where we feel most comfortable and purposely displacing ourselves in scenarios where we're, at first anyway, we feel uncomfortable, we feel out of place, and we earnestly try to learn more about these issues. Again, I'll give another example from my life when it comes to transgender issues. I don't know anyone personally who is transgender, so I try to become better aware. And rather than people who aren't transgender trying to tell me about transgender issues or what they're like or so on and so forth, I began to connecting with trans activists in my current job that really helps me connect with activists who are trying to push for certain issues of equality for trans people. I follow trans people on social media, not just Facebook. Twitter is really good, actually, to see the interactions. And this is really helpful to me personally. When you see the constant barrage of hatefulness that certain people have to endure. Trans people are just one of them, but there are others. But seeing, because they'll quote what someone said to them and then they'll respond. Seeing that really helps me put things into perspective insofar as what they go through on a daily basis that I can't even begin to imagine because I'm not in that position. I'm not in that place. Or I'll read their work. You have trans writers. They do some beautiful writing that specifically talk about their issues and what they're going through and what they have gone through and the type of discrimination and microaggressions that they endure. Findings indicate that perspective taking can combat automatic expressions of implicit biases. These biases, as neuroscientists have researched, foster and reinforce negative stereotypes. Thus, when we infuse these keys, when we infuse observing constancy, granting a platform to those who experience things that we just cannot relate to directly because we don't live those things, and perspective taking. When you infuse those things with compassion and the guidance of intersectionality and desire to learn and grow, I think these three keys help to catalyze better allyship, more inclusivity, and to overall spark progress within humanist communities. That's all I have to say.
Because we didn't have anyone else this morning, we have the opportunity for some Q&A, if you don't mind staying around and answering some questions. So I'm going to ask everybody who has a question to use the microphone because we are recording. Otherwise, your question won't get picked up on the recording, and then when people listen to Sincere's answer, they may not fully understand what the question was. So we can start with Cindy, right here.
Sincere, obviously, we veer way on the level of not being able to live the colored person's life, and I'm just trying to figure out what my reaction really was to when people were trying to say all lives matter, and so sort of like piggybacking on the reaction to Black Lives Matter, and just wondering, like, from a colored person's perspective and from someone who's in this like balancing and trying to keep perspective, what's the reaction to that?
Okay, thank you. I actually wrote something specific addressing that issue that actually is probably one of my most well-circulated articles that I ever wrote. That was a response to the All Lives Matter rhetoric. Basically, I'll try and give a parallel. When you have men who, when women talk about issues that they endure when it comes to men, there is a tendency, a high tendency for men, the first thing that they do is they have this reaction, this knee-jerk reaction to respond, not all men. That's what All Lives Matter sounds like. Because what women are talking about, these issues that relate to the way that they are harassed, the way that they are looked at, the way that they are objectified, the way that our culture produces this toxic masculinity within the male population that tends to engender, obviously, male privilege, but this male entitlement that has us view women in a certain way. They're talking about a tendency within our culture. They're not literally saying all men, but still, because that it's related to a part of our identity when it comes to men, there's a tendency for that criticism or that call out to spark this, it hits the ego, and because it contradicts or it conflicts with our worldview. And so it produces a male fragility, if you will, and they just come out the woodwork, oh, not all men are like that. Okay, so that's an example of what we have here when we're talking about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. What we're talking about is within our culture, there is a surplus of value associated with white lives and a deficit of value associated with Black lives. And this also kind of relates to something that I wrote about my last article with the Humanist, when I was talking about the huge discrepancy in media representations, or what they choose to concentrate on and not concentrate on when it comes to acts of terrorism. We see how much media coverage we get when we're talking about Paris, remember Paris, or with Charlie Hebdo, and more recently Belgium. And you see people's reactions to that. But at the same time, there were terrorist attacks around those same times, each time, and more recently with Belgium as well, it's the same thing. You also have terrorist attacks, let's say, for example, in Turkey, in Ankara. There was the second bombing in Ankara a day or two before Belgium. And nobody really knew about that. And just as many people died in that, and even more people were injured. Or when those people, by Al-Qaeda, were executed in Grand Bassam in Ivory Coast, executed. Nobody really heard about that either. When you had those two women going to the mosque more recently and detonate those the suicide bombs and killed all those people in the mosque, nobody really heard about that. Then when you see this thing happen in Belgium, that too is a tragedy. I'm not trying to downplay that, but then you saw all the media, constant media coverage of that around the clock. I'm like, I'm sitting there, because I listen to NPR all the time, like every day. And so I'm sitting there like, do they not know about this other stuff that's happening? What's going on here? It's the same tendency that we have when it comes to tragedies, when it comes to the worth, the implicit, people don't want to say it, but when it comes to the implicit biases that we have when it comes to white lives versus black lives. Of course, we know that, in general speaking, that all lives matter. They all should matter. But that just isn't how things play out when it comes to the criminal justice system, how they choose to react to certain issues. When you have cops who do things, they act in ways that they shouldn't have, or the prosecutor, they won't prosecute, or they go out of their way to find ways to hamper the entire process. Or if a thing actually goes to court, they'll be found not guilty. So when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, what they're talking about is the significance. Again, this goes back to the humanist philosophy. The humanist philosophy is one that's based on the idea that all human life has equal significance, and that it's just not what we see when it comes to those interactions with racial injustice insofar as police brutality and the way that those people are being gunned down. So that's what I would say to that. I mean, it's not about any type of black supremacy or anything mad like that that I've heard people say, because I'm all about the equal significance of all human life. But again, you see a surplus of value attached to certain lives and a deficit of value associated with others.
And we have Giovanni in the back.
My question speaks to your point on granting a platform. How do you do so, like when you, I don't know, for lack of better words, you want to suppress that platform? Example was my own personal experience. I was approached by a group that needed a place for a food bank. The group was very based in Roman Catholic. Now, I offered them the space when they asked for it, but I made it known that I was an atheist, and I came to bat when the Roman Catholic Church would not for them, because the Roman Catholic Church had turned out. So my question is, like, I would have much preferred that they didn't remain like a Roman Catholic institution, because it's still, when people go in there, they see a cross and they have a lot of, influence from the church. But the space was provided by an atheist. That they would not have had that opportunity to feed these needy people had I not given them a space to do it from. So in that sense, providing them a platform, I don't necessarily want to give the Roman Catholic Church a platform. You know what I'm saying? I would rather block every instance of giving them a platform than providing them with one. But in this case, I saw the needy people and chose to do something on their part, not for the Roman Catholic Church. That's where my problem comes in with, providing a platform.
Okay, yeah. I see what you're talking about. When I was talking about granting a platform, though, I'm really speaking more to in the social sense and less about the more literal sense that you're talking about. When I'm talking about granting a platform, it's like as a cisgendered person, granting a platform would then mean for me to better understand where a trans person is coming from. I have to grant them a platform in order so I can learn. Instead of me sitting there trying to dictate to them or patronize them about their place in this world or their place in this society, and trying to enforce my views and my ignorant perspective about their lives and what they go through, allowing them a platform to speak to me, to inform me. So it's also the same thing with, again, I gave this example before when it comes to men versus women. There is a tendency for men to patronize women about women-related issues. We look at reproductive rights and how men seriously try to tell women what they can and can't do with their own bodies, and they don't listen to what women have to say or the issues that they have to go through. Or in general, when it comes to the way that women are objectified, and if a woman is sitting there specifically telling you about the various ways that they're objectified within any space, when they go out in public or even on social media, and the way that they're treated with men, and men just come in and say, oh, well, and they try to impart their ignorant view about that issue that they haven't experienced. Granted, a platform means you're going to actually sit there and listen and grant them the space to inform you about their lived experience. So when I'm talking about granting a platform, I'm talking about the way in which marginalized groups of people are given the place to actually inform others about what they have gone through and what they're going through. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about granting a platform.
I was wondering if you could inform me how you as a black man feels in the Freddie Gray. He's the fellow that was basically broke his back, his neck. Spine, killed him. But when they showed the 6 officers involved, there's 3 black faces, I think. Mm. So I haven't had an opportunity to ask someone, how do you feel about that situation, that there are 3 black faces in that group?
Yeah, that's a good question. It still comes back to the same root issue. And that is, well, it's a few things. But one, I don't care if they're black. They still should be held accountable for what they did. This man was alive. This man was alive when they put him in the back of that police car, and by the time they took him downtown, he was dead. Something happened in between there. Every single person, I don't care if they're white or black, should be held accountable. And the issue is, I'm going to come to that. The issue is, when we're talking about certain institutions, when we're talking about police institutions, when we're talking about, I don't think I really concentrated on it here in this talk, when we're talking about white supremacy, the idea of white supremacy, what that is talking about is, again, the value associated with white lives versus other lives. The beginning of the police, the entire institution of police, was to harass and brutalize and murder black people. That was the entire foundation of police, law enforcement. So, throughout generations and the continued culture of anti-blackness, when you're talking about the police system, while I understand that, of course, not every single police officer themselves are evil or bad, whatever, what we're talking about is an institution that singles out, racially profiles, discriminates, brutalizes blacks at a disproportionate level. And when you have black officers who are associated with these types of injustices, they are a part of a system that tacitly or explicitly condones these acts. And you see this in recent activity. Well, it's not just recently, but in the past too, where you have these emails that come to light where you have police enforcement getting caught specifically saying racist things or targeting minorities. It's the culture, it's the law enforcement culture, it's how the system exists and continues to exist and enforce a certain ideology that profiles and denigrates the very being of black people. So those 3 officers, even though they're black, they're still a part of that system. Does that answer your question?
It does, but the perceived right, I don't want to beat it to death, but that perspective of privilege, I have like disconnect in my brain when I see three black faces. I'm not trying to say I don't understand that concept of privilege. The whole country, everyone who analyzes this and look internal for to see what's going on, it just causes a disconnect.
Mm. With that particular situation?
Well, even when any black or Hispanic or anybody's involved in the performance of evil against someone else, I don't know, I can't articulate any better right now. No, the white privilege is I know it's there, but there's a participation. Not okay.
No, keep on going.
I'm concerned about the participation of folks who want that platform in the discrimination themselves. It confuses my mind anyway. I don't know what it does to the whole nation. I'm trying to come to terms with this.
Okay. Yeah, so like I said, when you have those three officers, again, they didn't act by themselves, but they were three of the others who were involved in that incident. Again, it's about the institution and how they treat blacks contra how they treat others, or white people, for example. So I'm going to give another example because you were talking about it in a more general sense. So when we're talking about, for example, what happened with Eric Garner, for example, in New York, where he got, are you familiar with that? Yeah. So he was allegedly out there selling single cigarettes, and you're not supposed to do that. And so the officers basically, long story short, officers come up and try to, first the guy, obviously this wasn't the first encounter that Eric Garner had with that specific officer, because he said, why are you coming here again, harassing me, so on and so forth. A struggle ensues, and these guys come on him, and they're trying to restrain him, trying to take him in, and they, first of all, they do an illegal chokehold. You're not even supposed to be doing that in New York. They outlawed that years ago. And he's sitting there yelling that he can't breathe. My question is, I mean, he doesn't stop until, obviously, Eric Garner expires. When it comes to the participation in that act, even if, that's, all right, so Eric Garner was selling single cigarettes, okay? Does that warrant the death penalty? So since we know the answer is no, we know that how that was taken to that extreme level to where Eric Garner was killed, there's a discrepancy here. There's a problem with that. And it comes back to that disregard for certain lives. It's the same way with Tamir Rice, how that officer killed him. And you see it on the video. The car doesn't even come to a complete stop before the officer in the passenger side comes out and he shoots him point blank. Now, he lied, obviously, because this isn't the first time that this happened. Before the video was revealed, they claimed that they tried to tell him to put his weapon down and so on. There was no talking whatsoever, because the car didn't even come to a complete stop before the officer came out and shot him point blank. Now, how many kids do we know that plays with toy guns? Do you really think that that would have happened if he had not been black? Now, when I say we live in an anti-black culture, what I mean is, and this goes back to when I said the origins of police, anti-black culture means that during slavery, black people, they're nice. We were considered living tools, as Aristotle called slaves. We were considered living tools. And the institution of slavery was justified in that blacks were inferior creatures and that they need to be domesticated in this way. This is also the foundation of the European ideology of racism and how we get the racial stratification. So when, at the end of the Civil War, at the end of that, when blacks were granted emancipation, this is when you began, right then, this is when you begin to see the anti-black media, journals, newspapers, and even scientists, and this is all, like, you can actually look this up, even scientists, this is when you begin to see the anti-black, oh, well, black people, since we're no longer slaves, now we're a problem. This is when you begin to see, oh, these people are dangerous, they're threats, they'll rape white women. These are specific things that all these people said about black people. And this is also around the same time beginning to see what you see, what is considered Jim Crow, when you saw large amounts of black people beginning to become imprisoned. Started after Civil War, after blacks earned their freedom or were given their freedom. So you take this belief that blacks are viewed as a threat. It's still, because it's in every single facet of our culture, this seeps into our implicit biases. So when we're talking about racism, we're not talking about hatred. People have a close association with racism and hatred. That's not how it works. It's about biases that we have. It's the same exact thing when it comes to our male-centered culture. So I don't hate women, but because of the way I've been groomed, because of my environment, there's sexist ideology that we have that marginalizes other women, and that views women as second sex, as an other. It's the same thing with black people. So these types of views are also, you also have it in black people. This is why there's a term called internalized racism. There's a thing when it comes to women, it's called internalized sexism. This is where you get certain black Republicans who say some of the most obscene things that, for the most part, do not represent the black community. How you see what's Ben Carson, and every single time Barack Obama says anything, the things you see Alan West say about Barack Obama, this is what we're talking about. So not all black people are for black people, I should put it like that. So just because you have 3 black officers participating in a white supremacist institution, they are a part of the problem, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes with that particular instance. Again, I'm not saying any officer, I'm not saying they're all evil, because that's not the case. But what we're talking about is a culture, and there's a certain culture subsumed within our anti-black culture. There's a specific culture within law enforcement that has this view that blacks are a threat. This is why you have racial profiling. This is why you have in New York, stop it, yeah, thank you. And this is how you get things like that and how they justify these interactions, these constant, continual social interactions that marginalize people of color. So when we're talking about granting a platform, I think we're talking about 2 different things. When we're talking about granting a platform, we're talking about the ways in which we choose to examine our views about certain social realities by listening to someone or people who experience certain issues that we don't experience. So I have male privilege. It's undeniable that I have male privilege. So because I recognize this and I acknowledge this, I try to become better informed about issues that I don't directly experience as a man from women. Same thing when it comes to me being cisgender. So I have to learn, I have to reach out and learn from others. When we're talking about privilege, that's what we're talking about. So when we're talking about that specific instance, I think that kind of answers your question as far as, even though there was 3 black officers connected with that incident, I don't think that negates what I was talking about previously.
Question in the back? Here.
I'd like to hear more about your role in the humanist movement and the greater secular community. And you said that there's sometimes not an awareness in the secular and atheist community of social injustice issues. It's more of a pushback against the religious groups and their role in society and laws and things. And so how do we combat that? And how do you work with maybe progressive religious groups that are fighting against social injustice issues?
Yeah, 2 things about that. One, I'm the social justice coordinator with AHA, American Humanist Association. So what I do, among other things, the main things I do is I try to concentrate more on, so we have three main groups that we have that we're currently in the transition, and we're going to have, once everything's done, everyone's going to know because it's going to be a press release and so on and so forth. Everyone's going to know. But anyway, I'm concentrating on building up the Feminist Humanist Alliance, the Black Humanist Alliance, and the LGBTQ Humanist Alliance. And so we're going to try to better engage humanists in outreach programs to openly show that humanists can be out there, and just like you see so often, religious groups get involved in outreach programs when it comes to, mass incarceration, when it comes to certain political issues or social issues. We want to show people that humanists are out there too, because a lot of times you do have humanists who engage in these type of issues, but they don't let it be known. So when it comes to religious organizations, we do work with certain religious groups, but we really do try to focus more on non-religious groups. Now, when it comes to, what was the other part of your question?
The larger secular
Okay.
atheist community and their reaction to it.
What we're trying to do is normalize, all right, you've heard the expression normalize atheism. We're trying to better normalize the fact that you can be good without God. And so through these outreach programs, my job is to show that you can be a force for good without all the God beliefs. And so that, when it comes to within the secular community and social justice, I actually anticipated someone's going to ask, because when you were talking about there's certain issues that tends to be concentrated on and other issues that are neglected. So I have written right here, when I'm talking about mainstream narratives, I'm talking about, this refers to the tendency of the collective reproducing a routine centering on very similar subjects to the exclusion of other matters. When the established feedback loop normalizes discussions driven by the concerns of majority group representation, which tends to be in the secular community, straight white men, there are those of us from other communities that are left wanting. So when we're talking about there's a tendency to focus more on combating creationism, for example, or separation of church and state. You know, when you see Christian hegemony try to insert itself in political and legislative issues, of course, we're going to be there to say, hey, no, this needs to be more better realized through a secular lens. I get that, and I'm all for that. I'm a part of those type of issues. But at the same time, we have to attend to issues on a social level, but also on an economic and political level that don't always revolve around those same issues. So when we're talking about religion, you have some people that will state that, as Christopher Hitchens said, that religion poisons everything. Well, that's fine if you want to believe that, but that has nothing to do with the way that people are discriminated against every single day due to certain forms of discrimination and oppression that haven't anything to do with religion. So I think that we have to expand our lens when it comes to what we're focused on, what we concern ourselves with, because it can't always and only be about, oh man, these religious people, concerning ourselves with scientific literacy, which is important, but that's not the whole picture, because you sitting there trying to continually and only exclusively to the point of exclusion, talking about scientific literacy, when you have certain groups that are being harassed and being othered every single day. It's just to the point of being that we're supposed to be a force for good, that we don't even try to acknowledge these things. So my job is to tend to both issues, because I participate in both issues. We just recently had a rally last week at Capitol Hill. I know everyone's heard about the reproductive court case with the Supreme Court. We were out there rallying for that. And there were other religious groups that were there with us too. There was one of the loudest protesters was this Catholic, he was a black Catholic man. He had a bow tie and everything. He was one of the loudest people there. It was awesome. But we have to concern ourselves with issues other than just combating religious hegemony. Because at the end of the day, while religious hegemony does affect our lives, and I get that, and we must find ways to push back on that, that is not the only reality that we contend with on a daily basis. So this is the type of stuff that I frequently talk about when I write, and when I talk, and when I have my marginal influence, when I try to influence others within the community as far as certain organization leaders, I try to say, hey, what about the, because before I was working with AHA, I was a regional director of American Atheists, and I was also a board member with Black Nonbelievers. So I've had time to speak with certain people, like Dave Silverman and people like that. And so I do try to do my part like that as far as, hey, why don't we also talk about this or whatever.
We have time for one more question. And I don't know who had their hand up first. Okay.
I'm going to try and answer both of them real quick, if you want.
All right, jumping off the last guy's point, due to a disability, you know, even though I live in Pennsylvania, really the culture that I spend the most time on is the internet. And, you know, as a blogger, I'm sure you're aware of this, but the response to social justice on the internet is really bad. It's a train wreck. You know, there's some very unapologetic misogyny within the atheist community. I can't speak to the racism within the atheist community. But, you know, I think you make some very good points, but at the same time, with your last statement, but at the same time, I feel like you only kind of addressed the people who are interested in rectifying these problems. Whereas on the internet, there's a good deal of just disinterest in trying to educate themselves. And within live atheist conferences, I see a lot of the mentality of that we don't need to worry about the online atheist culture, but because you know, the internet's always been a nasty place. But at the same time, a lot of my deconversion happened over the internet and by the transitive property. A lot of my mom's deconversion happened because of interactions I had with atheists over the internet. And the misogyny and, from what I understand, the racism is driving a lot of people who might be interested, who might be otherwise interested in listening to us away. So I guess my question would be, so I don't really feel like we can actually afford a culture war within our movement at this point. And I guess my question to you would just be, you know, having a profession that involves a lot of being on the internet, you know, how do we deal with people who just, you know, they feel like they've got theirs as far as their rights and just general disinterest in doing anything about the misogyny and racism that takes place within the atheist community or in the world in general?
Yeah. So a few quick things on that. One, as Dale McGowan said, he's a humanist author. He said, atheism is the first step, humanism is 1,000 steps that follow. And what you have is a tendency for certain people to take that one step and think that they've arrived when they clearly haven't. And what you say is true. Certain forms of biases and discrimination does drive people away. I've seen this so many times that people, I get a lot of people who talk to me and they become, at first they're enthusiastic because they deconverted or they're getting involved in certain issues, but when they see the type of culture that exists within the atheist culture, they get, you know, they soon become disinterested and then eventually they disengage. And that is involved with black people, women, when it comes to people of the LGBTQIA communities. I've seen that a lot with them. So my thing is, I do have a tendency to focus on those who are actually interested, because we have to consider two things when it comes to people who are incurious. People who are incurious are geared by motivated reasoning, and if you try to cast pearls before swine, as they say, what there's a tendency to encounter is the backfire effect. So they will double down in their beliefs. So I try to be wary of that. Well, I am wary of that. I try to be cautious of that. So because of that, when it comes to what I'm trying to accomplish, I focus on those who are curious and those who do want to learn. Because if not, you have a tendency, there may be that what I say to someone who doesn't want to hear it, they will double down in their beliefs. And this happens all the time. This is something that happens within humans. So, but my writing, when it comes to my writing, that is a different story. Because when I write, I do write for those who may not know about certain information, or they may either be uninformed or misinformed about something. And it is the case that my writing gets shared with people who have divergent beliefs, but they're able to, within themselves and on a personal level, alone, away from people, read something and say, and that does spark some curiosity. That's happened before. I've had people come to me and tell me that that's happened with them. But when it comes to me personally actively engaging with someone who I know is just convinced of certain, I'm not going to waste my time. Because it's hard, first of all, it's hard to convince someone when they're convinced otherwise. Because that's just how we are cognitively put together. So I try to focus more on those who do express some level of interest in what we're talking about, or they do put forth the admission that they are trying to learn, or that they do know that they have a limited perspective on something. So other than that, I'm not going to waste my time.
I'm going to give it over to Kate here.
Thank you so much. All right, so I want to remind everybody that we're going to go downstairs for lunch and we're going to continue the conversation. But before you do that, you might want to check in with Diane about your membership. See if you're due, if you need to pay your dues, if you want to become a new member, yay. And just check in with her and make sure that you're up to date. Now, I guess I just wanted to say thank you for coming. What I find, at least with our group, is that people are really curious. But a lot of times, they feel like it's not okay to ask certain questions. They don't know the right language to use. Kind of how I feel when we have the scientific literacy people come in and they use lots of words that I don't understand at all, right? My background is the social justice stuff, so I feel like my mind is boggled, and I get really worried I'm going to look stupid, or I'm going to say something that shows how much I don't understand about an issue. So I just want to encourage people, especially at lunch, if you have a question, ask your question. You don't have to worry about feeling stupid. You don't have to worry, as long as your intentions are good, about offending somebody. You want to make sure that this conversation feels accessible to you, and it's not just a bunch of social justice language floating up there that maybe you don't have a grip on. Sound good? Good deal for lunch? All right.
Is there an email address?
Oh, yeah. I can be reached, first of all, I can also be reached on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, but my email is Kirabo, Kirabo, at AmericanHumanist.org.
Do you have cards or something?
Yes, I have cards too. But also, if that doesn't work or whatever, you can just, if you go to American Humanist website, on the staff list, yeah, there you go.
I think he's tagged in a lot of stuff on Facebook, too. So you can probably find him there.